we can start our meeting today. So my name is Dominique Burgeon. I'm the director of the Liaison Office here in Geneva, the FAO Liaison Office here in Geneva, and I'm delighted to welcome you, to warmly welcome you to this first edition of the dialogue series that we are launching today on the right to food. I would like to extend my sincere appreciation to the permanent representatives, to the missions, and all the guests who are joining us today in person in Geneva or virtually online. As you know, 2024 was an important year with the celebration of the 20th anniversary of the adoption of the Right to Food guidelines. Right to Food also being the theme of the World Food Day last year, and both the 20th anniversary and the Right to Food underscore the critical role of the right to adequate food in achieving food security and nutrition for all, and the need for a human rights-based approach to its implementation. You are all familiar with the global food security situation. You know that we are not on track to achieve zero hunger by 2030. Numbers, you know, more than 700 million people chronically undernourished, 2.8 billion people not having access to healthy diets. So most of the food security and nutrition indicators are not on the right track, while in the meantime, the current agri-food system is producing 30% of the greenhouse gas. It is having a huge impact on biodiversity, soil, and water. So there is, as you know, a consensus that we need to indeed transform the agri-food system, and which is really at the core of what we do as FAO, but what I would say the international community and is committed to. And we believe that in that context, investing in human rights approaches across all sectors is key for more inclusive, resilient, sustainable, and efficient agri-food system to ensure appropriate standard of living for all now and for the future generation. I believe this is with this in mind that together with our colleague and the Right to Food team of the Rural Transformation and Gender Equality Division at FAO Headquarters, which is led by Juan, which is full screen. You are full screen, Juan, in Rome. We have decided to organize this thematic dialogue series. You know that our office has a number of thematic dialogue series, be it on humanitarian matters, on trade, on environment, on health, etc. So today we are launching a new one on the right to adequate food. This is the edition number 1. There will be in the coming weeks and months other events that will take place, and which will seek to emphasize the need for concerted action and commitment at all levels to fully realize the right to food. And really, this is to advocate for I would say, the redoubling of efforts to build inclusive agri-food system that upholds human rights, and to highlight the cohesion and collaborative action that we have at all levels between Rome and Geneva. You know, there is a very active group of friends of the Right to Food in Rome, and across, of course, us as UN agencies. We have several agencies around the table and virtually, as well as with the mission, the civil society. I'm glad to see several representatives from the civil society in the room today, as well as academia. And of course, I want to warmly thank our co-sponsors, the Permanent Mission of Brazil, and Excellency, warm welcome to today's event, and the Permanent Mission of Germany, who have agreed to be the co-sponsor of this thematic dialogue series, and we are very grateful for all the work you do in support of the right to adequate food. So with this, you didn't come for my introduction, you came for the substance. So we will begin with opening remarks from Her Excellency Miss Cecilia Kiku Ishtani, the Deputy Permanent Representative at the Permanent Mission of Brazil. And I would like to invite her to deliver her opening remarks. Excellency.
Thank you, Dominic. Dear colleagues and distinguished participants, the colleague of Mission of Germany, and also my colleagues from the Mission of Brazil, here, Minister André, Councillor Thiago, and dear friends. Let me begin also by thanking the FAO office in Geneva in the person of Dominique Bourdieu and the Right to Food team of the Rural Transformation and Gender Equality Division for organizing this timely and important dialogue series on the right to adequate food. This initiative strengthens the human rights-based approach to combating hunger and malnutrition and promotes inclusive, sustainable, and resilient agri-food systems. It's an honor for Brazil to deliver these opening remarks at an event that brings together such a diverse group of stakeholders and underscores the need for greater coordination among the UN hubs in Rome, Geneva, and New York. Too often we operate in silos and forget that we are part of the same multilateral system. The challenges ahead are evident. Progress towards ending hunger and poverty, goals 1 and 2 of the 2030 agenda, is slowing or reversing. Hunger has returned to levels we hope were left behind. We urgently need stronger political will, more effective action, and better alignment of efforts and resources. Brazil considers the fight against food insecurity and all forms of malnutrition a fundamental prerequisite for eradicating poverty, reducing inequality, and achieving sustainable development. When the right to food is not guaranteed, the enjoyment of all other rights is at risk. The right to food is not just a moral imperative, it's a legal obligation and a foundation of human dignity. The normative framework is well established. The right to food is enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. It affirms the rights of all people to regular access to sufficient, safe, nutritious, and culturally appropriate food, produced sustainably and with dignity. In Brazil, the right to food has been enshrined in our constitution since 2010. It's a central pillar of our food security and nutrition policies, coordinated through the National Food and Nutrition Security System, SISAM. SISAM is built on intersectoral coordination and active civil society participation at all levels of government. Civil society plays an advisory role through the National Council on Food and Nutrition Security, the CONSEA, with similar councils at the state and municipal levels, reinforcing the system's participatory and decentralized nature. We are also proud of programs like the National School Meal Program, PNAE, and the Food Procurement Program, PAA, which connect family farming with public food distribution. These are not assistance policies, they are structural, rights-based instruments that promote food sovereignty and social inclusion. Still, despite the solid legal and institutional foundations, the right to food remains unevenly implemented around the world. Addressing this requires renewed political momentum, stronger coordination, and increased international financing. During its G20 presidency in 2024, Brazil launched a task force to create a global alliance against hunger and poverty, placing the right to food at its center. The alliance was officially launched at the G20 Leaders Summit in Rio last November, and now includes over 170 members among governments, UN agencies, development banks, philanthropic organizations, and civil society networks. They are committed to supporting national policies and accelerating impact. Guided by the right to adequate food, the Alliance recognizes hunger as a denial of dignity, a violation of rights, and a structural challenge that demands coordinated policy solutions. Its policy basket includes programs rooted in national experiences, such as those in Brazil, and promotes integrated action across social protection, school meals, smallholder farming, and climate resilience. Looking ahead to the COP30, which we are holding in Belém, in the heart of Amazon, in November 2025, Brazil is working to place food security and nutrition at the center of the climate agenda. We aim to strengthen the link between sustainable food systems, climate resilience, and social protection, and ensure that fighting hunger and poverty becomes a central part of climate debates and financing. Let me conclude by recalling the voluntary guidelines on the right to food adopted by FAO Council in 2004. 20 years later, they remain a vital reference for countries seeking to transform their food systems and meet their human rights obligations. Brazil played a leading role in negotiating and adopting the guidelines and remains one of their strongest advocates as co-chair of the Group of Friends of the Right to Food in Rome. We hope this dialogue series will build bridges between UN cities, institutions, disciplines, and regimes, regions, and bring us closer to a world where the right to food is a reality for all. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Excellency, for your opening remarks, for so clearly setting the scene, for reminding us of the importance of the multilateral system and of the centrality of the right to food, and for outlining the effort of your government at all levels, at global level with the Global Alliance Against Poverty and Hunger, but also reminding us of, or at the end of the day, you are walking the talk at country level with all the initiatives that you have presented. So thank you so much. And of course, we are all looking forward to the Global Alliance and COP30 in Belém, which will be another very important event. So thank you again. And thank you for being with us in this series together with Germany, of course. Now we will have a number of presentations. We'll follow with a presentation by Juan Echanove, the Right to Food team leader, and Claire Mason, the Right to Food advisor based here in Geneva. Their intervention will introduce the right to food basics, share relevant tools, and unpack what it means in practice. And then this will be followed by a presentation by Abigail Koshimo-Brown from OHCHR, Human Rights Officer on the right to food at OHCHR, will provide a technical overview of the Geneva-based mechanism that exists for the use of countries and other stakeholders in support of the realization of the right to food. Then we hope to have some time for a Q&A session towards after those presentations. And I would like to invite you, of course, in person, it will be easy, but for those online, to use the Q&A module to ask your question, and we'll do our best to take as many questions as possible. The rest is, I have some notes on reminding everyone on how it works for webinars, but after 5 years of webinars, we are all very familiar with it, so no need to remind you. So now I would like to invite Juan and Claire to introduce us to the right to food guidelines, and unpack for us how this will work in practice. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dominique. Thank you very much indeed. And good morning to all of you in Geneva and joining us online. And as Dominique said, I'm Juan Echanove, and I lead the Right to Food team at FAO. Let me start by saying again that today we are not just holding a briefing. As Dominique already explained, we are launching a dialogue. And I should add that with it, we are also launching an invitation to reclaim a right that is both ancient, but also urgently contemporary, as Her Excellency just reminded us. Can we move to the next slide, the first slide, please? So let me first show you briefly the structure of today's presentations. We'll be walking through what is right to food. We'll also discuss the human rights principles that guide it, who hold the rights, and who carries the duties. Also, what happens when these rights are violated, a bit on the historical and legal foundation of this right to food, and also how the right to food anchors other global food policy tools. And finally, also a little bit on the work that FAO does in terms of promoting the right to food. I will do the first part of today's presentation, as said, and later I will pass the floor to my colleague Claire Mason, which is in Geneva today in the room, who will lead the second part. So what is the right to food? I mean, let me start by saying that, as mentioned by Her Excellency, it's a very well-defined right. It's defined by the UN Committee on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights in very much detail in its General Comment number 12 from 1919. And it is defined in the way it's seen in the screen. Let me read this for you. The right to food is realized when every man, woman, and child, alone or in community with others, has physical and economic access at all times to adequate food or the means for its procurement. And let me break this down because each word here in this definition matters. So every man, woman, and child means, of course, universality. No one is excluded. Whether you live in a remote village in Nepal or a favela in Brazil or in a refugee camp in Sudan, you have this right, no exceptions to it. Alone or in community with others means that the right can be exercised individually, like for instance, when any of us is going to a supermarket, or collectively, like a community running a food cooperative, for instance. Physical access means, can you actively reach food? Are there markets? Are there infrastructure, transportation? For instance, in some urban slums or in conflict zones, of course, even if food exists, people can't physically get to it. And then economic access means, can you afford food? Because often prices might rise, but wages don't, right? At all times. So this is about not just having food today or tomorrow or next month, but ensuring long-term access and also ensuring preparedness. For instance, in the Sahel, for example, people often face a post-harvest lean season when food runs out. Adequate food. Adequate food means not just any food, but food that is sufficient. So enough to meet your energy needs. That is safe, meaning that it's free of contamination or toxins. That is culturally appropriate, and this aspect is often forgotten. So it means respecting traditions and respecting identity, and which is nutritionally balanced. So it's not just about calories, but real nourishment. For example, giving only rice to indigenous children, let's say in Guatemala, for instance, might meet energy needs, but maybe might not meet cultural or nutritional needs, right? Or the means for its procurement, that part of the definition means that you don't have to grow your own food, of course, but you must have a way to get it. That could be money, jobs, or land, social protection. I mean, for instance, India public distribution systems guarantees subsidized food grains to millions, to dozens of millions, actually. So as we see, this definition isn't just a theoretical one. It's very practical, it's actionable, it's very measurable. Let's go to the next slide, please. The right to food and food security is something that needs to be clarified because sometimes there has been some confusion, right? So they are different but complementary concepts. Food security is a state of being. It's the state when people have regular access to enough, safe, and nutritious food to have a healthy life. But it doesn't tell you how to get there, how to guarantee this, or who's responsible when things go wrong. Whereas the right to food, on the other hand, is a legal human right, as we have seen. It says that every person is entitled to food and that governments have a legal obligation. So it guarantees this right for all. So while food security asks whether people have food, the right to food asks why they don't, who is responsible, and how to ensure dignity and entitlement. Next slide. And let me elaborate a bit more in these two words, because at the core of the right to food, it's basically these two things, dignity and entitlement. Dignity, meaning food must be accessed in a way that respects people and their right to provide for themselves and their families and their communities. So it's not a favor, right? And entitlement, meaning that it is a legal right. It's not a policy suggestion. Governments have a duty to make sure people can eat, can access food, and with autonomy, with agency. And we all should work towards that end. This kind of swiftly changes, the angle, because it's not about feeding the poor. Again, it's about recognizing people as right holders, putting people at the center. Next slide, please. So, in right-based food systems, often we talk about the Panzer principles. And this acronym stands for participation, accountability, non-discrimination, transparency, human dignity, empowerment, and rule of law. But they aren't just decorative or a catchy acronym. They really have to guide real laws, policies, reforms, in any sphere relevant to the right to food, social protection, land taxes. And let me give you a few examples on how these principles work in practice, maybe with some examples from countries. So participation and inclusion. For instance, in Nepal, communities help draft the Right to Food Act through national consultation. So they really had a say. Accountability, I think India, it's a good example because, in many regions, in many states of India, people can really file complaints. There is some states that have these grievance red systems if food rations do not arrive. Non-discrimination, for instance, in Colombia, the Constitutional Court protected indigenous children facing hunger. Rule about that. Transparency, I think, for instance, Mexico clear front of pack labels that show sugar, salt, and fat content. It's a powerful example of this transparency. Same policy exists in Chile and other countries. Dignity. I mean, there is this situation, this case in Scotland, where older people, it was ruled that they are supported with well at home, not just through handouts, but with autonomy. So it's a very good example of promoting human dignity. Empowerment, let me call here the case of Brazil that Her Excellency already described, where civil society has helped and is helping shaping food policy via CONSIA and other means. And rule of law, of course, right? Like, for instance, I remember when South Africa courts ordered school meals to continue during COVID lockdown some years ago. Let's move to the next slide, please. So now let's talk about who are the people at the center of this framework. Who are the right holders? In short, honestly, everyone, all of us, this pertains to all of us, but especially those who face hunger and exclusion. This includes smallholder farmers. This includes consumers, particularly those in poverty, also agri-food workers, right? And among them, certain vulnerable groups deserve a specific protection, like women, youth, children, indigenous peoples, the elderly, persons with disabilities, because these groups can be disproportionate. So the right to food must be designed with them in mind. And who are the duty bearers? First and foremost, of course, the states. That includes national governments for sure, but also local authorities, because often they are in charge of certain services like school meals or land regulation. Donors and international partners also have legal obligations towards the right to food because, as the international law defines it, they must ensure that aid, investments, trade policies should support and not harm the right to food. And also the private sector should respect human rights too, by, for instance, paying fair wages, avoiding harmful practices like land grabs, or of course, promoting safe, nutritious food over ultra-processed food, right? Next slide, please. So under international law, states have three fundamental obligations when it comes to the right to food: respect, protect, fulfill. Respect. This means governments must not interfere with people's existing access to food. For example, if a community grows its own food or access markets, the states must not evict them or destroy their land. It's about non-interference. Then protect. This is when states, this is the obligation for states to protect people from third parties, like powerful companies or landlords, right, who might violate the right to food. If a company, for instance, pollutes a river or grabs land from indigenous peoples, the government should step in, regulate, and eventually hold them accountable. So it is about oversight. It is about regulation. And finally, fulfill. Because sometimes states must take proactive steps to help people access food, to facilitate and to provide for those who can't do it on their own. And that can mean laws, social protection programs, but maybe sometimes food assistance in emergencies, for instance, etc. So it's about implementation, about support. So these obligations are not optional. These are binding legal duties. Let's go to the next slide, please. So beyond respect, protect, fulfill, international human rights law outlines some other key duties states must oversee. Non-discrimination, it's very important. So states must actively ensure that no group is excluded, especially those who are already marginalized. This means designing policies in a way that they really prioritize women, that they prioritize children, indigenous peoples, and others who face extra barriers. But also, economic, social, and cultural rights are subject to this idea of progressive realization. What that means? This recognizes that not all countries are able to ensure the immediate immediate realization of these rights for all. So this is a continuous obligation, a gradual development that countries have to sustain. However, and this is very important, even in resources-constrained context, states are required to do all they can to progressively realize this right to food, using the maximum available resources, and so making the right to food a budget and a policy priority, right? So states must not wait for violations to happen. This is also very important. They have a duty to prevent by passing laws, by enforcing regulations, and also by setting up early warning systems, right? And also oversight bodies. And we also have to keep in mind that elimination of hunger is a core obligation. That is non-negotiable. That is the top priority, the core, the heart of the right to food. And finally, according to international human rights law, states should also work through collaboration beyond their borders. So there are some third-party obligations. And this includes, as I mentioned before, donors aligning development aid with human rights principles, and countries, for instance, reviewing trade and investment policies to ensure that they do not harm food security in other nations. So ensuring that the right to food is not affected by trade or investments. Let's move to the next slide. This one I will skip quite fast because later on, our colleague Abigail from the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights will elaborate further. So let me just say that, in terms of what happens if someone's right to food is violated, that there are multiple ways people can seek justice, and not just in theory, but in real life. And we tend to group them into 3 levels: national, so people can bring cases before national courts, human rights institutions, ombudspersons, etc. Regional, if justice is unavailable at home, people can go to the existing regional human rights bodies. And of course, there is international level instruments that we shall see later. Next slide, please. And with this one, I will finish my segment. So let's close this section by clearing up a few myths. And this is really important because there's some misunderstandings around the right to food that often weaken our ability to defend it. An important myth is, people sometimes think that the right to food is a vague idea. It's something abstract or generic or theoretical. In reality, as you can see, it's one of the most clearly defined rights in international law, with legal content, with criteria, with obligations, which are very clear. There is also this myth that it's just about giving food to people, right? Nurturing people, sorry. And in reality, as we saw, it's actually about ensuring access and availability to food in ways that respect dignity, culture, nutrition, fairness. So it's not about charity, it's about justice. Another myth is that it's mainly or only a legal issue. Well, of course it's grounded in law, but it's also a practical policy tool. And my colleague Claire will elaborate more about that when she will touch base on the voluntary guidelines for the progressive realization of the right to food. So the right to food helps shape better food systems, inclusive policies, and also, I would say, stronger institutions. Another myth is that it's the same as food security, and I hope we really clarify that they are complementary terms, but they are different concepts. And finally, there is this myth that it's just one theme among many, one topic in agri-food systems. No, it's not. The right to food is a cross-cutting issue. It's an umbrella issue. It touches the environment and natural resources. It also touches health, nutrition, climate, trade, social protection, gender, agriculture, everything. You can't build a just food system without a right to food. And with this, let me now pass the floor to Claire Mason, who will take us through the legal framework, the voluntary guidelines, and also a bit of the FAO work towards promoting the right to food. So back to you, Claire.
Thank you, Juan. Thank you for such a clear presentation. Claire.
Thank you, Juan. Thank you, colleagues. I'm very pleased to join you. So as Juan said, this part of our presentation will essentially set what Juan has just been saying within its related international legal and policy frameworks, introduce and explain the right to food guidelines, showing how they support practical action, and provide some more examples of how the right to food translates to practice, including through the work of FAO. So if we look at the first slide, you'll see the normative framework through which the right to food is established. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, is really foundational for international human rights, a landmark achievement. It starts by recognizing that we are all born free and equal in dignity and rights, wherever we are and whoever we are, by our very nature as humans, we all have human rights. Article 25 of this declaration establishes the right to a standard of living adequate for our health and well-being, including food. So this declaration gave rise to the development of legally binding human rights treaties, among them the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which at Article 6 recognizes the fundamental right to life and survival. And of course, none of us can deny how relevant food is to this. Food is essential to life and it's essential to our survival. But let's look at the detailing of the right to adequate food, which you'll find enshrined in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So here it's in Article 11 that we find the right of everyone to adequate food as part of the right to an adequate standard of living. It also sets out the obligation to continuously improve living standards and for governments to take steps to ensure this right is realized, including through international cooperation. Article 11 also establishes the fundamental right to be free from hunger. So as Juan mentioned, economic, social, and cultural rights are subject to progressive realization. And this recognizes the time it can take to establish the necessary conditions to realize them. However, there is an immediate obligation upon states to take steps. And there is also an immediate obligation to tackle hunger. And here it is very clear. So to paraphrase Article 11, states are obliged alone or together to improve production methods, conservation, distribution of food, making full use of technical and scientific knowledge, disseminating knowledge on nutrition, to develop or reform agrarian systems, and really ensuring efficient and better use and development of natural resources. It also makes clear that there should be an equitable distribution of world food supplies in relation to need. As of today, there are 173 states parties to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and thus they are bound by its provisions. So if we can move to the next slide, please. In the latter part of the last century, we saw a growing movement to further the realization of the right to adequate food in line with international law. Intensive and global, let's go back, sorry, Anna, to this slide before. Intensive and global agricultural production and trade was shown not to significantly have impacted the hundreds of millions of people that were still food insecure. And so at the World Food Summit of 1996, leaders effectively reclaimed the right to food, aligning more firmly the pursuit of food security and nutrition to international obligations relating to the right to food. But how could they do this? So work began towards clearer definitions and explanations that could guide countries as to their international right to food obligations. And this began with the development of General Comment 12, which Juan has already referred to, and which was issued in 1999 by the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. This general comment provides its authoritative normative interpretation, which Juan introduced at the beginning of the presentation. But it remains highly important in interpreting not only what the right to food is, but where it is violated and what to do to remedy this. In addition to its definition of what the right to food is, it emphasized that the right to adequate food is indivisibly linked to the inherent dignity of the human person and is indispensable for the fulfillment of other human rights. It identifies 4 core elements of the right to food: availability, accessibility, adequacy, and sustainability. And to refresh our memories, food should be available to everyone, everywhere, including in remote regions where people are in detention or other examples. It should be physically and economically accessible, including for people in vulnerable and marginalized situations. It must be adequate in terms of its nutritional value, dietary needs, consumer preferences, and cultural acceptability. And it must be available sustainably over time, including for future generations. To further support outreach, understanding, monitoring, and reporting of the right to food, the Office of the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food was created in 2000. And today, of course, all of us are very familiar with the important work of the current Special Rapporteur, Mr. Michael Thackeray. So in addition to the right to food mechanisms and instruments I've mentioned, it's important to note that there exists a wealth of additional normative content which addresses aspects of the right to food in relation, for example, to specific groups or peoples who are often in more vulnerable situations. And this includes binding treaties, such as the Convention to Eliminate All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and also we find related declarations, such as the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and Other People Working in Rural Areas. These all add to the normative framework on the right to food, and they help countries and all of us understand better how to implement this. You can also see, as Juan mentioned, that geographical regions develop through negotiations their own binding treaties. And so we can see that in Africa region and Latin America and the Caribbean, for example. We move to the next slide. So continuing the drive at the end of the very last century and starting this century, we can now turn to a tool developed very much in the context of Rome, but which also brought together the Rome-based and Geneva-based human rights environments to support how we can translate the right to food into practice. This is where you have the voluntary guidelines to support progressive realization of the right to adequate food in the context of national food security, also known as the Right to Food Guidelines. We move to the next slide. We already established that the right to food means ensuring everyone everywhere has access every day to sufficient, nutritious, safe, and affordable food, and that governments have the obligation to protect, respect, and fulfill this right. It's a progressive right. Governments must dedicate the maximum of their available resources to realize this. And so we see the evolution of the recognition and development of the normative content of the right to food, resulting in the development of the Right to Food Guidelines through negotiations with civil society actors, experts, and the United Nations, and their adoption by FAO Council in 2004. We can move to the next slide. The Right to Food Guidelines are a powerful, practical tool to help governments and all stakeholders implement measures that will ensure the progressive realization of this right through policies, strategies, and legislation. They are an important policy tool which complement the legal sources of the right to food obligations, and they cover the full range of actions to be considered by governments at the national level to build an enabling environment so that people may feed themselves in dignity. The guidelines have inspired the development of further FAO and CFS tools, such as the Principles for Responsible Investment in Agriculture and others that you will see subsequently. They have thereby contributed to the development of the vast normative framework for the just transition of agri-food systems that we strive for today. As a policy tool, the guidelines are voluntary, but it is important to remember that they are grounded on binding legal obligations under international law. We move to the next slide, please. You'll see here the index. So you see that the Right to Food Guidelines cover 19 key areas for policy and legislative coherence in agri-food systems to create an enabling environment through national measures and international cooperation, aimed to tackle structural inequalities, overcome the root causes of hunger and poverty, such as discrimination and power imbalances, and to ensure realization of the right to food, leaving no one behind. You see the topics range from good governance to natural resources, to food safety and consumer protection, to nutrition and to safety nets, people in situations of vulnerability, to natural and human-made disasters, food aid, monitoring and reporting, and international cooperation. All of these are essential to the core elements of the right to adequate food. So here you can see the range of additional tools that have been developed through multi-stakeholder and intergovernmental dialogues at the CFS, Committee on World Food Security, such as the Land Tenure Guidelines, the Framework for Action for Food Security and Nutrition in Protracted Crisis, which this year marked their 10-year anniversary, and the Voluntary Guidelines for Gender Equality and Women's and Girls' Empowerment, which were adopted in 2023. All of these tools aim towards the progressive realization of the right to adequate food. So let's look at some examples of the right to food in practice. Juan has already mentioned in his presentation several achievements, and here we can find methodological tools that have been developed by FAO alongside the principles which support the uptake and use of the Right to Food Guidelines, and these can be further accessed at our Right to Food website. We look at the next slide. We'll look at some examples, very brief. There are many examples of legislative achievements and country advances. If we look very quickly at guideline 5 of the Right to Food guidelines, speaks about institutions. And Germany is one example which has set up its Right to Food unit. And of course, many countries put human rights and gender equality at the center of their international development cooperation. Guideline 7 on legal framework, we know that more than 30 countries have explicit protection of the right to food in their constitutions. Brazil has mentioned it, Nepal, Egypt is another. And we also can see framework and sectoral laws, such as school feeding laws, front of pack labeling laws, regulation of advertising against children in relation to ultra-processed foods. And then, of course, it's important to highlight multi-stakeholder action, such as the plural parliamentary fronts against hunger, who work together and have achieved more than 100 legislative actions towards the right to food, academic networks, and civil society or vibrant civil society actors, such as the Global Network on the Right to Food and Nutrition and Right to Food coalitions that we see, for example, in Malawi and Kenya. So if we move on to slide 25, sorry, the next slide, you'll see now the Right to Food team's work at FAO. We work to strengthen implementation of the right to food and to end hunger, malnutrition in all its forms. Through technical assistance, we support member countries and all stakeholders, governments, parliamentarians, academics, civil society organizations, consumer organizations, and others to understand and better implement the right to food. We provide capacity building for policy development. We have a right to food e-learning, and we support the uptake and use of the right to food guidelines. And we also provide thematic sessions such as this thematic dialogue. So let's move forward. Before I end, I'd really like to invite all of you who may be interested in learning more about the right to food to access our certified e-learning, which is in 2 parts, and you can get it through the QR code here or from our Right to Food website. And finally, to bring it back to Juan's words at the start of today, we're not just holding a briefing today, but launching a dialogue and an invitation to reclaim this ancient and yet ever more urgently contemporary right, the right of every person everywhere to adequate food today and in future generations. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Claire. I'm sorry if I was putting you a little bit, but I think between you and Juan, it's a real tour de force to go from the beginning to where we are now and all the tools that have been developed. I think it's amazing. And for Juan, also multitasking, because you need to know that there is a very active engagement that is ongoing online with a Q&A, with a number of points, very good points that have come on, for example, the role of academia. How can we modify? How can we have curricula adjusted? How can research be supporting evidence generation? Or a discussion on CEDAW and the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women and the right to food, and also a very valid point on issues of state accountability. But perhaps, Juan, I would ask you, perhaps when we start the Q&A session, if you could give a highlight of the key points that have come in the Q&A for the people who are in the room, I think, and those attending online. I think it would be very valuable. And now, because this is done also in partnership with our colleagues from OHCHR, and we are delighted to have Abigail will provide us with insights into the human rights mechanism that exists to sustain the right to adequate food and at the service of countries and all stakeholders. Abigail, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join you all. So complementing Juan and Claire's presentations, I will be speaking in further detail on the various human rights mechanisms which have been instrumental to the development and defense of the right to food. As you can see on the screen, there are quite a few. I'd like to begin by explaining the structure of the various mechanisms before moving on to present on their role in relation to the right to food. There are 2 types of human rights mechanisms within the UN system: treaty-based bodies and charter-based bodies. Treaty-based bodies are based on various conventions and covenants that state parties ratify and accede to, while charter-based bodies are those established based on the UN Charter. The 10 human rights treaty bodies, made up of committees of independent experts, monitor implementation of the core international human rights treaties. The charter-based bodies include the Human Rights Council, under which special procedures, universal periodic review, and independent investigations are established. OHCHR, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, provides substantive and secretariat support to all of the different mechanisms. The treaty bodies, I begin with the treaty bodies. The treaty bodies perform functions in accordance with the provisions of the treaties that establish them. Their thematic focus and their working methods all differ slightly, but in general, they consider state parties' reports, consider individual complaints, conduct country inquiries, and adopt general comments, such as General Comment number 12 on the right to food, and organize thematic discussions to interpret the provisions of the treaties. State party reviews are undertaken when a state ratifies or accedes to a treaty, in which it undertakes a legal obligation to implement the rights enumerated in the treaty's provisions. Each state party to the treaties also undertake a legal obligation to submit periodic reports to the committee. With the example of the right to food, that being the Committee on Economic and Social Cultural Rights most commonly. In addition to state parties' reports, the treaty bodies may receive information on a country's situation from other sources, including national human rights institutions, international non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and other UN entities and other stakeholders. In light of all of the information received, the relevant treaty body examines country situations in the presence of the state parties delegation and engages in a constructive dialogue over the course of 2 days. Following this constructive dialogue, the committees then publish concerns and recommendations referred to as concluding observations. In addition, 8 of the committees can also receive petitions from individuals. These petitions may be brought by any individual who claims that their rights under the treaty have been violated by a state party to the treaty, and bring a communication before the relevant committee, provided that the state has recognized the competence of the committee and that domestic remedies and that all legal avenues have been already exhausted within country. 6 of the committees may also initiate country inquiries if they receive reliable information containing well-founded indications of serious, grave, or systematic violations within a state party. There are harmonized guidelines adopted by each of the committees that provide guidance on the sort of information that state parties are expected to provide in line with their legal obligations. As seen on the screen, common guidelines include information on the legal framework for the protection of human rights. For example, whether or not a state party has a constitutional provision or legislation that enshrines the right to food, and on the cases concerning the right to food that have been brought before the domestic courts. Another common guideline is on the information on measures taken to implement human rights at the national level. For example, public awareness campaigns on the right to food and measures to support civil society in the promotion and protection of the right to food. Another common guideline is on information on the national reporting process, such as on the participation of various line ministries in the reporting process and the contribution of information relevant to the right to food. As noted, the right to food is enumerated under Articles 11.1 and 11.2 of the Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights. The treaty body mandated for the review of measures taken by state parties to fulfill the right to food is carried out most commonly by the Committee on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights. In addition to the harmonized treaty body reporting guidelines, there is guidance on information to be submitted to the CESC, that being the Committee on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, on the right to food specifically. This includes measures to ensure the availability of affordable food in quantity and quality sufficient to satisfy dietary needs, free from adverse substances that is culturally acceptable. Measures taken to disseminate knowledge of the principles of nutrition, including healthy diets. Measures taken to promote equality of access by disadvantaged and marginalized individuals and groups, including landless peasants and persons belonging to minorities, to food, to land, credit, natural resources, and technology for food production. And lastly, whether or not the voluntary guidelines on the right to food have been adopted, and if not, why not? It should be noted that there are additional articles in the Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights relevant to the full realization of the right to food, such as those relating to land and non-discrimination, which reporting guides list additional requested information. Information on the right to food does not always have to be reported to the Committee on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, but rather may be reported to other treaty bodies. For example, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination has in the past raised concerns and made recommendations on the disproportionate levels of food insecurity among racial and ethnic minorities, while the Committee on Migrant Workers has raised concerns and made recommendations on the exploitation and working conditions of migrant workers in the agricultural sector. Moving on to the charter-based mechanisms, we begin with special procedures. The special procedures of the Human Rights Council are independent human rights experts with mandates to report and advise on human rights from a thematic or country-specific perspective. With the support of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Special Procedures undertakes country visits in order to gain first-hand insight into the situation within a specific country, Special Procedures acts on individual cases of reported violations and concerns of a broader nature by sending communications to state parties and others, and presents annual reports to the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly. The mandate of the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food was first established in 2000 by the UN Commission on Human Rights and later mandated by the Human Rights Council in 2007. The Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food is an independent expert appointed for 3 years up to a 6-year term by the Human Rights Council. The current mandate holder, as mentioned, is Mr. Michael Falkery, a professor of law and director of the Food Resiliency Project at the Environmental and Natural Resources Law Centre. He assumed the mandate in May 2020, making this year his final year as mandate holder. Some of his previous reports to the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly can be seen here on the screen. More recently, the Human Rights Council also established the Working Group on Peasants in 2023 to promote the effective and comprehensive dissemination and implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and Other People Working in Rural Areas, adopted by the General Assembly in 2018. In this slide, you can see examples of past communications sent by the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food. These have included alleged violations of physical violence faced by small-scale fishing communities, food shortages in prisons, measures undermining food price fixing safeguards, as well as manipulation of food distribution programs. In each communication, the mandate holder reports on allegations of human rights violations they have received and requests clarifications on them. Where necessary, the experts request the concerned authorities to take action to prevent, to stop the violation, to investigate it, to bring justice to those for those responsible, and make sure that remedies are available to the victims or their families. The mandate holder later reports to the Human Rights Council on the communications sent and replies received, raising public awareness on the cases concerned. An important point to note is that the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food can join communications with other mandate holders. For example, the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food and the Special Rapporteur on the Right to a Clean and Healthy Environment may respond to information on allegations received and issue a joint allegation letter together. Moving lastly on to the Universal Periodic Review, established in March 2006 by the UN General Assembly. The Universal Periodic Review is a unique mechanism of the Human Rights Council that calls each UN member state to undergo a peer review of its human rights record every 4.5 years. Since its first cycle in 2008, all 193 UN member states have been reviewed 3 times. The 4th cycle of review began in November 2022. The UPR provides each state the opportunity to regularly report on the actions it has taken to improve the human rights situations in their countries and to overcome challenges to the enjoyment of human rights, as well as to receive recommendations informed by multi-stakeholder inputs and pre-session reports from other UN member states for continuous improvement. We were introduced earlier to the voluntary guidelines on the right to food. Here you can see past Universal Periodic Review recommendations from state parties to one another that coincide with these voluntary guidelines. Now, while the voluntary guidelines are voluntary, they are grounded in international human rights law and standards. Now, across the voluntary guidelines are examples of UPR recommendations from a range of state parties from across the regional UN groups of member states concerning the right to food. And these recommendations are illustrative of the development of international human rights standards on the right to food through state practice. Here are further examples. Here are even further examples in which I'd like to highlight one from Brazil to Zimbabwe, in which Brazil recommended further policies to support food production, such as farm insurance, access to credit, and the purchase of food by the government to ensure a stable market for family farmers. Lastly, each of these mechanisms that I referred to have follow-up procedures that differ slightly as provided by the respective covenants, optional protocols, and resolutions ratified, acceded to, and adopted by vote. For example, given the cyclical format of the Universal Periodic Review, state parties are required to report in follow-up on measures adopted to address recommendations raised by the other state parties. Additionally, after the adoption of concluding observations by the Committee on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights and other treaty bodies, state parties are required to submit follow-up reports on measures taken in the period since the review to implement the committee's recommendations. Based on this report, the committee will determine whether the measures taken are satisfactory, partially satisfactory, or unsatisfactory. To conclude, there are a number of measures established under the UN Charter and various human rights conventions that reinforce the international human rights laws and standards relevant to the right to food. These mechanisms provide state parties with the means for a reliable and independent review of past and present measures undertaken to fulfill the right to food and guidance for future measures to ensure the adequacy, availability, accessibility, and sustainability of food for all. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Abigail, for the force to present that, and I think it complements really well the first two presentations by Juan and Claire, and then indeed your presentation on the body of mechanism that exists here in Geneva for the use of countries and other stakeholders really in support of the right to food. It is very telling, including all the examples that you have shown. So thank you very much for that. Now, time for a few comments, questions. I would like to start by the room. When you have the floor, you could tell us about your affiliation, and then after that, we will ask Juan perhaps to give a couple of minutes summary of all the very rich interaction that we have seen on the Q&A module. So please.
Thank you. My name is Alef Mine. I run the One Goal Initiative for Governance. I feel concerned about the toxicity of food. On the one hand, now standards that say that if a crop or produce has been damaged in one way or another, it can be rechanneled into the lowest price category without saying that it has been done so, without saying where the stuff came from and what happened to it. This is being done and agreed in the UN. So I feel very concerned. And then, and this is in Europe, you know, it's not elsewhere either, you know. And then there is, I've been asking also some private foundation or organizations who was showing that they were providing food to food banks in order to avoid waste. So this was more in the environmental kind of action. And I asked them, so how do you check the quality? They said, well, we make sure the macronutrients are there. And I said, well, do you check for toxicity? And I said, no.
Okay.
Yeah, and also when I look at academia outside of the UN, they are talking now not about right to food, they're talking about the management of starvation. And when I tell them, so what about, you know, toxicity? Is it the word they use is that, well, that's a dogmatic question I won't bore you with. So I feel very worried right now.
Okay, thank you. So we will ask colleagues perhaps to react on that. Yes, sir, please.
Hello, everyone from Scaling Up Nutrition Movement, and thank you so much
Thank you.
to the three of the presenters today for such a clear overview. It was great to also hear about how nutrition is represented in the Right to Food guidance and various frameworks. I guess this series is coming off the bat of the Nutrition for Growth Summit. So $4.8 million were pledged to improving nutrition outcomes. And we've also got a couple of other key moments in the Geneva agenda coming up, including the extension of the potential extension of the WHA nutrition targets in coming months. So I'm interested in how the Right to Food approach can be used to advance and contribute to nutrition outcomes, but also how nutrition can also be used to advance work on the right to food. A big question, but maybe a couple of reflections that any of the presenters might have today.
Thank you very much. Great to see some participating. Yes, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again. This is wonderful. I'm Shira Graubart. I'm with FMC. We're a crop protection company. My question is really if you could discuss more on the role that the farmer plays in this concept of the right to food. It's an often overlooked member of the supply chain. And I was wondering if you could speak more on the farmer's role, but also the ability that the role that access that farmers have to critical inputs, and what role this plays in these general policies and regulations that you're advocating.
Thank you. Great to see the private sector as well. Thank you. Any other comments here? Yes, please.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Sibyl Gearens from FAO International. We are a human rights organization promoting rights to food and food sovereignty. Thank you very much for giving us this insight and this in this complexity, but actually very, as you said, very clear right with clear criteria, with clear normative framework, and also giving us again a bit the background, the historical background. I will maybe also comment on the role of peasants. I think is really important also that you also mentioned the Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and other people working in rural areas, as we also know that the people who produce our food are many times also the ones that don't enjoy the right to food. So I think we know that strengthening their rights will also help us to implement the right to food. And in that sense, FAO, this year, we're really also focusing on one specific right that is very related to the right to food, and it's the right to land. So we'll also launch a campaign on land and looking at the landlords and the increased land concentration. And this is exactly also what you mentioned. So it's the access, the control over land. If people don't have that, many times also they will go hungry. So, and in that sense, we're also looking forward to the International Conference on Agrarian Reform next year in Colombia. So we really hope also that this topic is getting to the agenda again, and that we can also hope to fulfill the right to food by also looking at all the other relevant rights.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for an excellent point again on behalf of FAO. And perhaps, look, I will give the floor back to Juan and Claire, perhaps. Bearing in mind that we are starting the dialogue series today. So what we see is that there are already a lot of points that are coming up that will be served for the dialogue. Of course, I would like to remember that we have a team here in Geneva. We have Anna, we have Claire, we have Yasmin, Dan. So quite a team within the office here. We have the Right to Food team in Rome. We have Right to Food experts across the organization. So I would really invite you to reach out to us and tell us, okay, yes, in the next dialogue, this aspect could be perhaps a bit more unpacked. But so this is to say, Juan, you have just a couple of minutes. You don't need to cover everything, including what's in the Q&A. We will have more of such dialogues, especially when I see the very large number of people we have online, as well as in the room. We'll have a bigger room next time, I promise. But Juan.
Thank you, Dominique, and indeed, thank you for the questions. I will really try to be brief, keeping that in mind that you will have the opportunity in the further sessions of this series to go deeper, insights of some of the aspects that we have been discussing. On the question on toxicity and also food banks, and basically the whole notion that, of course, the right to food is not just feeding people, as we have been saying, right? Often people ask us, what are the main activities that you should promote for the realization of the right to food? And I always give the same answer. It's not about what you do, it's about how you do it. It's the how what matters. So are food banks good for the realization of the right to food? It all depends how you do it. If you are providing non-nutritious food or intoxicated food, of course, they could not be really a mean for that. So indeed, the right to food applies in all its integrity. So it's not just about feeding people, it's making sure that the food you provide is non-toxic, is safe, is nutritious, is diverse. And there are many things happening in that regard right now in Europe and elsewhere, like trying to connect local production to food banks, for instance, right? So yeah, thank you for raising that point. Maybe something very brief in terms of the role of farmers. Big and small, every farmer, every producer, and of course for them to produce, they often need access to inputs. And land was mentioned is the primary mean for production, but also, of course, means to fertilize the ground, whether that is via agroecological means or chemicals or any other mean, water. I mean, there is a number of resources that farmers need to produce. So ensuring access and availability of those inputs are definitely a key aspect of the right to food. Do you want, Dominique, me to go briefly through some of the questions in the chat as well, maybe?
Please touch on some of the key points, please, if you don't mind.
There was this very good question in terms of the role of the academia, and indeed, it's phenomenally important in every regard. And we have some great experiences in that regard. For instance, in Latin America, there is the Observatory for the Right to Food that was set with the support of FAO that brings together something like, I believe by now, Claire, 120 or something universities from the whole continent. There are interests in Africa, for instance, to replicate the model. And the purpose of this observatory is basically to inform policies and strategies by governments. And they are doing exactly that in a very meaningful way. But I didn't put that in the slide because the slide was about obligations, right? And it's not that the academia as such has an obligation in the same level as the states or decentralized bodies or others, right? But it's a very good point. There was also this little bit of a discussion in the chat, a very good one about progressive realization. Because sometimes it's true that that has been used as I could say excuse to postpone things. Because it's progressive, country may say we don't want to start now because we don't have the means. But again, I think that international it's very clear in that regard. It's about making sure that your available resources are prioritized towards that end. Of course, it could be completely unfair to ask for a country that in a short span of time get rid of all the problems of food insecurity if they don't have the resources. And this is why also there are obligations by third parties, meaning international cooperation. But there is a core obligation that can never be postponed, which is avoiding people to die out of starvation. There is no reason, no justification, no excuse for that to happen. Never. That's also very clear in the international framework. And there were also a number of questions in terms of the adoption of the voluntary guidelines. Of course, the FAO is doing a good deal of work in that regard, but it's not only us, it's of course also IFA, WFP, bilateral donors, EU, and many others, right? And more importantly, the countries themselves. So there are several countries that are doing a lot in terms of the actual implementation in practical terms of the voluntary guidelines, and some of the examples have been mentioned in the presentation. And finally, questions in terms of CEDA and basically the whole notion of non-discrimination and the right to food, how the right to food can be a tool to advance the agenda of human rights in the COP, right? And I think this is something that Her Excellency mentioned before in terms of how Brazil sees the upcoming COP and the role of the right to food on it, right? But what I would only add here is that we should never look into the different instruments of international law like as separate things. I mean, it doesn't matter much, honestly, if CEDA is explicitly mentioning the right to food or not, because the right to food is guaranteed by everyone, everywhere, at all times, because it is enshrined in the covenant. Over.
Thank you very much, Juan. Claire?
Yeah,
few more words.
perhaps just to address your question about nutrition and the importance of nutrition to the right to food. So we work very closely with our colleagues in the nutrition division at FAO in order to specifically address how human rights based approaches to nutrition can really change the whole kind of aspect of meeting this obligation. You mentioned the Nutrition for Growth Summit in Paris recently. We held a side event there with our colleagues from UNFPA and also with the gender colleagues. and nutrition, specifically on empowering women and girls, because we know that women and girls are generally far more disadvantaged in terms of meeting their nutrition needs, and far more overrepresented in terms of food insecurity and malnutrition in all its forms. And also just to highlight something that Juan mentioned as a practical example in terms, which brings in academia. So the academic network that works in Latin America and the Caribbean, bringing together all of these universities with specific curriculums and departments, usually on law departments. We also brought together nutrition specialists and nutrition departments of those universities so that they could also form part of this kind of academic knowledge and growth and exchange information, so that there's a much closer kind of understanding in relation to the different technical specialists. It's vital to strengthen the kind of links between nutrition specialists and the right to food and human rights specialists. And to just finalize by saying that our next thematic session, our next thematic dialogue should be on nutrition and the right to food. That's our hope, which will also speak to particularly gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. Thanks very much.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. I think we are already well past the time, but I would like really to thank you all, because I think it has been a very good start of this dialogue series. Thank, of course, our speakers, the strong partnership we have with OECHR, with the team of FAO across the house, but this I will have the opportunity to thank my colleague separately, but also all your engagement. I mean, it's impressive, all what we have seen under the Q&A module. We'll capture all that, make sure that it will inform the future dialogues. I would like also to remind you that all dialogues that we are having are available for many years on the webpage of the FAO office in Geneva. We will send you the link, the proceedings to all those who have participated, but also all those who have registered. So thank you very much for participating. Thank you, Excellency, for the support and for your great remarks on behalf of Brazil and for your commitment to support this dialogue series. Thank you also to Germany for being a co-sponsor. Thank you for all joining. I already touched on the next dialogue series, so we will inform you as soon as possible when it will take place. And in the meanwhile, please stay tuned and have a great break for those who are going to celebrate Easter. Thank you.